In this presentation, we're going to look at various forms of evidence that we use to increase our knowledge about evolution. And the first form of evidence everybody's familiar with are fossils. What exactly are fossils? They are remnants of previously existing organisms that died a long time ago. Actual bones or feathers or tendons or ligaments, usually the hard parts fossilized better. Or they could be replicas of organisms that died a long time ago. For example, an organism dies and most of it decomposes except bones, and the bones are buried and they're replaced by minerals and rocks. The rocks look exactly like the bones, but it's not actually bone. It could also be traces of organisms. Like, for example, on this slide, you can see on the right some pictures of some footprints. And these are more than 3 million years old. They occur in Africa, and they show an older adult walking side by side with a child. And this happened through some mud, then later the mud hardened and it fossilized. And the other picture on this page from around the same time period is a fossil of a certain hominid, in an organism that has characteristics intermediate between humans and other primates. For example, between humans and chimpanzees. And this particular one's about 3.5 million years. The species name is Australopithecus afarensis. And it was found in Africa some time ago. And while they were digging it up and working on it, a song by the Beatles was playing on the radio called Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. So that's what they named this fossil. And it's unusual in that about 70% of this individual is found, which is very unusual. And it has a lot of primitive characteristics, such as a very small brain size, but it has characteristics that shows it walked fully upright. And from the fossil record, we can get a sequence of events that happened on Earth through time. Deeper fossils are generally older. This is referred to as relative aging. The deeper it is buried in the rock, the older it is. Older fossils are simpler. And we'll get an example of that later when we talk about the history of life on Earth. Today's organisms did not exist in the past. In the past, if you go back far enough, organisms that existed were simpler than today's organisms. Go back even further and they were even less complex. These are some general trends we can see in the fossil record. And a general sequence of events, the history of life on Earth. We have a four-legged animal that existed a long time ago. And later, following this group of animals, we can see that it is a four-legged aquatic animal, kind of like today's seals or sea lions. Not exactly the same, but kind of along those lines. It could crawl around on land somewhat awkwardly, looking at its features. It was probably a pretty good swimmer. Then later, in the fossil record, more recently, it became better adapted to aquatic living. Its hind legs were really, really tiny, and its pelvic bones are really tiny. The hind legs were getting smaller and smaller. And even more recently, all remnants of the hind legs are internal. They're just tiny remnants of the bones they had in the past. And this is what whales have. This is the evolutionary history of whales. And we can see a picture of the evolutionary history of whales. In the past, they were four-legged, land-dwelling animals. And then they became better and better adapted to swimming. And they eventually lost their hind limbs. And their forelimbs became fins. And so we can see all sorts of trends like this in the fossil record. And looking at the very top of this figure, you can see that whales are actually somewhat closely related to hippopotamus and cows. And here's some other pictures of whale fossils. And the further back you go in time, the longer and more complicated their limbs. So these are trends we can see in the fossil record. General history of life on Earth, we can also see some trends. Earth formed around 4.5 billion years ago. Then about 3.5 billion years ago, we see prokaryotes or bacteria in the fossil record. Then about 2 billion years ago, we see eukaryotes, cells that are a bit more complicated with nuclei and membrane-bound organelles. So the Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago, and for more than half of its history, there's nothing but bacteria. Then about 1 billion or so years ago, we see the first multicellular animals. So for most of Earth's history, there's nothing but single-celled organisms. Then about 1 billion years ago, single-celled multicellular animals showed up in the fossil record. Then about 0.4 billion years ago, we see terrestrial animals, the first animals that live on land. And we know these dates because of absolute dating. How do we know what we know about absolute dating? Well, we talked about relative dating earlier. Older fossils are where compared to younger ones? They're buried deeper. That's relative dating. Absolute dating, we know the exact age of something that's millions or billions of years old. How do we know that? You've heard of radioactive dating. We look at radioactive elements that have unstable nuclei that break apart. And they break apart at a certain rate. And for different geologic or biological reasons, we know how much was in the original sample, and we look at what's left, and we get an idea how old it is. Different elements, different atoms decay at a certain rate. For example, the half-life of carbon-14 is about 5,730 years. It takes about 5,730 years for half of the original carbon-14 in a fossil to decay. A carbon-14, we can reliably date things that are about 75,000 years old. If it's older than that, we use different elements. For example, there's one called potassium-40 that has a half-life of 1.3 billion years old. And for different, again, biological or geological reasons, we know how much was in the original fossil or the original rock. We measure what's left, and we can determine how old it is. And here's a graph that shows radioactive decay using half-lives. And looking at this graph on the right, we start out with a number of darker elements, and it has a certain half-life, and about half of the darker elements are gone, and we have red ones. And then we go another half-life, and we have more red ones and fewer darker ones. And again, we measure how much of the darker ones are left. We know the original amount, and that's a half-life. We can get dates from them. And we measured the half-life of a lot of different atoms. If you go online and look up periodic table of the radioactive elements or periodic table of isotopes, you can see the half-life of a lot of elements. A lot of them are very short on a matter of days or minutes, and so we can directly measure those. We can watch them decay very, very quickly. And this is a table of different elements and their half-lives that are commonly used in radioactive dating. So we use radioactive dating to get an idea of how old something is. And we often date rocks and minerals around fossils to get an idea of how old fossils are. And does everything fossilize? Do we have a complete and total fossil record of all life on Earth? No. Fossilization is a very rare event. It's very unusual for a bone or something else, a footprint, to get preserved so it lasts for millions of years. But it does give us a snapshot of what happened in the past. Some more evidence for evolution is called biogeography. We look at maps, where islands and continents are, and we look at how they move around, continental drift, and we look at their climates, and we look at how living things are located on maps. For example, the organisms on the Galapagos Islands are similar to organisms in South America. So you have a pretty good idea that a few million years ago, when the Galapagos Islands formed, organisms from South America made their way over to the Galapagos Islands and changed. And we can compare islands that are closer to South America with islands that are further away from South America. And we can look at how the organisms have changed as they have been more isolated. Another example of biogeography, think about Australia and all the marsupials in Australia, the pouched animals like kangaroos. These marsupials used to be everywhere in the world, looking at the fossil record. But now they're mainly in Australia. There aren't that many elsewhere in the world. Where'd they go in the rest of the world? Well, they were replaced by more advanced animals, placental animals. Well, why weren't they replaced in Australia? Well, millions of years ago, Australia moved. It drifted away from other continents. Then later, placental mammals developed, and until humans introduced them to the islands, there were no marsupials on Australia or the surrounding islands. So that's why Australia has a lot of marsupials today. In Eastern South America and Western Africa, there are similar species of amphibians. Eastern South America and Western Africa. Why is that? We'll see a picture in a bit that describes this. If you look at South America and Africa, it kind of looks like they fit together like puzzle pieces. And here are those different species of amphibians in the red. They're very similar. They occur in the tropics. They are different from each other, but they are somewhat similar. Why is that? Well, millions and millions of years ago, these continents were connected to each other. And there's one big population of frogs, and then later the continents separated, and now we have similar species on separate continents. They can't get through or across the oceans because amphibians can't survive salt water. So these are some examples of using biogeography to describe how life has changed through time. Another thing we can do to gather evidence for evolution, how things have changed through time, is to look at comparative anatomy. For example, all land vertebrates and some that used to live on land but have since moved back to oceans, like whales and dolphins, they have the same bones in their forelimbs. They have an upper arm bone, the humerus. Then they have two lower arm bones, the radius and the ulna. Then they have a bunch of little bones, the carpals. And then some longer bones at the end, the metacarpals and phalanges. And if you look at all land vertebrates, plus whales and dolphins, they have the exact same arms. The exact same bones in their forelimbs. These are called homologies, looking at homologous structures, homologies. Similar structures that indicate a common ancestry. So we look at these structures and we get a good idea that all of these land vertebrates sometime in the past had a single common ancestor. And we can also look at comparative anatomy and look at vestigial structures. Did you know that you have a tailbone? And some people are actually born with short tails. We have vestigial or reduced tails. Our coccyx and our sacrum. These are tailbones. Our ancestors, millions of years ago, had longer tails. But for whatever evolutionary reason, the tails got shorter. Think of goosebumps, chill bumps, goose pimples. You have muscles under your skin connecting to the hairs under your skin. And when these muscles contract, it gives you chill bumps or goosebumps. Those are called erector pili muscles. And why are those muscles there? Well, for hairier animals, if those hairs stand more upright, they can hold a pocket of air next to the skin, and that can help hold heat in. On the other hand, if the muscles relax and the hair lays more flat, it's easier for heat to escape. So they use these muscles for heat regulation. Also think of a cat contracting those muscles and fluffing up its fur and it's trying to look bigger, being aggressive. It may also have had some benefit to our hairier ancestors. But for whatever evolutionary reason, we lost all of that hair in the past, and now we have these vestigial muscles that really don't do anything for us today. Similarly, we can look at embryology. How have embryos developed over time? How do embryos compare between different species? And the more similar the embryos are, the more recent the common ancestor. And if you look at these embryos, the earliest stages, they all look exactly the same. And then later, things like fish and amphibians start looking a little bit different, but a lot of other organisms, you really can't tell the difference. Then a little bit later, you can start seeing some differences in birds and lizards and cows and dogs and humans. We compare embryology, get an idea about how species have changed through time. And by looking at these different characteristics, we can see which organism is most similar to other organisms, and we can see patterns in how organisms are related to each other. And we can get an idea of where they came from, what their evolutionary history was. We can see patterns in nature by looking at these various forms of evidence. We can develop evolutionary trees. We can see who's related to who and who's more distantly related. For example, in Biology 2, you'll learn that mammals, vertebrates, and starfish are more related to each other than either is to things like squids or insects. And looking at, you can get a little bit more specific, a little more closer detail, look at smaller groups of organisms, and this is an evolutionary tree of different groups of dinosaurs. And they're grouped together based on their similarities. We look at comparative anatomy. We can also compare our biochemistry and our genes. And the more closely related we are, the more genes we have in common, the more our DNA looks alike. We have similar DNA. And remember the genetic code? All living things, with a few bacterial exception, use the same exact genetic code. That indicates that perhaps all life on Earth had a single common ancestor. And looking at this figure on the left, it shows the genes of different organisms that have been cut up by certain enzymes in certain ways. And if organisms have similar pieces of DNA, they're more related to each other. They had a more recent common ancestor. And by looking at genetics, we figured out that the organism that is most similar to us are chimpanzees. We and chimpanzees share a lot of our genes and a lot of our proteins and a lot of our structures. We are 98.5% similar to each other. There's one protein in your blood called hemoglobin that carries oxygen. And our hemoglobin and the hemoglobin of chimpanzees are exactly the same. So these are different forms of evidence that we use to increase our knowledge about evolutionary biology.